Come on, you're allowed to say good morning. I've got a lot to get through, so we'll cut to the chase. I've got only half an hour and I've got an awful lot of stuff to get through. Okay, the point is we are engulfed at this time in a situation of unprecedented uncertainty, mainly because we've got no idea what the trading environment is going to be for this industry and really no idea what the final policy is going to be. We're told, of course, that we face challenges and opportunities. I insist. There isn't one opportunity today post-Brexit that didn't exist before Brexit. You know, I insist. There's no opportunities that weren't there before. But the challenges are a great deal tougher. And I think we face a fundamental issue now. We've really got to make up our mind whether we want the food industry to be part of an internationally competitive, high-tech industry, or are we moving towards a situation where the backbone of the food industry, basically agriculture, is going to focus on land management, really environmental issues, and backing away from producing food, and we're going to rely on exporting far more of our food. So that's my background to what I want to say. I think there are three challenges which I hope no one disagrees with, which we have to deal with. First one is sustainability. What do I mean by sustainability? I mean that in improving our productivity in this industry, we have to do it by producing less pollution, and that includes greenhouse gases, but also we've got to use less of the world's natural resources. We've got to produce our output using less water, less energy, less minerals, etc. Then we've got to enhance our standards. We know about animal welfare. We already have very high standards in this country, but we can never rest. We've got to raise standards in terms of, how to say, animal welfare, food safety, farming operations. But what we don't talk about very often, and it's just as important, we're a high-tech industry. We really should be thinking about the standards for people employed in the industry. You know, what about better careers and better opportunities for people? We just don't talk about that enough. And my third challenge really is to become more competitive. By producing distinctive value-added products, I want us to be able to export more products and therefore reduce imports coming in here. And if we do that, we will automatically not only improve our trade balance, we'll improve our self-sufficiency and food security. These are objectives which people say they want to achieve, but the only way you can achieve it is by becoming more competitive. The very idea that you start with, self-sufficiency, that's just protectionism. That takes us absolutely nowhere. Now, in order to deal with these three challenges, we need to have the correct trading environment and we need the correct policy environment. And the next point is you must prioritise. I'm sure if I was a politician here, I'd say, I agree with all of this, yes, and of course we're going to do it. We lived for 40 odd years with the Common Agricultural Policy, which has multiple objectives. And the point about any policy that has multiple objectives is you never achieve any of them satisfactorily. And the CAP is a first-class example of that. What you must do is prioritise. You must decide what is your priority, and then the other two become the constraints. So for me, it's pretty clear. The priority is to achieve a competitive food industry, but of course, subject to the constraint that what we do must be done in a sustainable manner, and we must also, of course, raise our standards. I'll leave you to decide where you think the government's priority is at the moment. Let's just think about some of these trading uncertainties we face. In theory, the government has said that, it won't extend the transitional period. The virus may change that for it as we go forward. But as we stand today, they say we're going to end at the end of this year, no matter what. So in theory, we could be facing WTO most favoured nation tariffs at the end of this year, and they would be disastrous for the food industry. Government says they're now happy to take some sort of basic Canada deal with no more talk now of Canada plus, plus, plus. You may remember all those things they used to talk about. Just a basic free trade deal, which, and the trouble with that is you're removing tariffs, but you won't remove non-tariff barriers. And this day and age, it's the non-tariff barriers that really matter for most industries, not least food industry. Okay. The next thing is, of course, the government seems to think that you've got to get some way with some sort of United States trade deal, because this has become a prize for Brexit. You know, this will demonstrate that somehow or other we've, achieved something, even though their own figures that came out the other day suggested the benefits for the country as a whole would be negligible. Trouble is, 62% of our food goes to Europe, our exports. Only 9.5% go to the United States, and then the United States has a completely different regulatory environment. So, America wants us to move towards their regulatory environment, but if we do that, it creates no end of problems with Europe. Northern Ireland's in a different position than the rest of the food industry now. It's as though it's remaining inside Europe in the customs union, the single market. For the rest of us in GB, our food will no longer be automatically accepted in Europe. There will be non-tariff barriers, which will have to be paid for by someone. The costs, they say on average, are about 8%, but that doesn't include all the time wasted with checks and, of course, all the bureaucracy that's going to go with it. So we face that future in terms of our exports to our largest market. And if you read David Frost's speech in Brussels the other day, you may say, well, at the beginning of these negotiations, it's all posturing, etc. But I thought it was a pretty clear message in there, really. Sovereignty was above everything else. And if that meant we had to go for a less advantageous trade deals with Europe, then so be it. And this focus on the short run the whole time. You've got to get it done next year and etc. We really should be thinking about where we're going to be in 5, 7, 10 years' time. That's what really matters to this industry, not what happens this year, or next. It's where we'll be in, the medium term. And I don't really hear too much talk about that. What about the policy challenges? When we used to talk about Brexit, we said, well, it's all about opening up opportunities in third countries for this country. But the trouble with agriculture in this country is we've got a very high cost base, and we are never going to make our way in the world by selling agricultural commodities to other parts of the world. Rare exceptions, but generally speaking, our cost base is far too high. Anyway, that's what they said about Brexit. But when it came to agricultural policy, and really I'm talking about Mr. Gove's policy, which seems to be, basically where we are at the moment. He took a completely different approach from this. Wasn't it looking out, really? It was more a case of saying we're going to focus on the environment, land management, public goods, etc. We didn't hear too much about this trading environment. And the government argues that by taking this approach, they create a non-tariff barrier. In other words, what they're really saying is we're trying to put up the barriers against people importing in here. Where is the idea of an aggressive exporting policy you need? It's a defensive policy. It's one that's more or less given up and said, well, we're going to do our best to keep imports out, but really it's not too much here about us getting opportunities on world markets. Even worse than this, I read Henry Dimbleby's speech at the Oxford Food Conference, and he himself, he said the food strategy, which he's leading, was insanely broad. That was his words, and he's right. I said a few minutes ago, if you have lots of objectives, you can't achieve them all, etc. And yet this food strategy is trying to hit every single target you can dream of. And worse than that, my interpretation of his speech is he's siding with critics of modern farming, more or less blaming farming for the fact that, we have an obesity problem in this country. That's completely wrong to ever associate farming with that. In fact, somehow or other, because we have been able to produce food and get down the cost of food, this is creating the health problems in this country. If you take that attitude, God help us. And unfortunately, he seems to be taking that. So here's my main point. I think we really have got to choose between whether we want to have a competitive food industry in this country, or are we going to focus more on land management and import more food? That is the choice I think we face today. And let me tell you how I think we're going to rise to these challenges and how we can achieve a more competitive food industry and indeed deal with those constraints I spoke about. If you look in this country here, food demand is growing relatively slowly. Why? Because we're well fed and we're affluent, so we're not eating a great deal more food. But if you look around the world, those 2 billion middle-class consumers in those emerging countries, their demand for food products is growing very rapidly, about 6% a year. And if we are to take advantage of that, what we need to be is internationally competitive, and we have to be super efficient. First point to grasp on this internationally competitive is that it is supply chain based. I've already said, producing agricultural commodities, we can't be competitive on world markets for agricultural commodities. What we can be is highly competitive in the market for food products, distinctive food products, And if we're talking about food products, then we are talking about a supply chain that produces those products, not an individual sector of it, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. What do I mean by super efficiency? I mean sustainable intensification. I'll say a little bit more about that later on. But sustainable intensification essentially delivers the sort of productivity that lowers production costs, and it does so by reducing the industry's demand on the natural economy and therefore achieving those other objectives that I spoke about earlier. So supply chain based for competitiveness, sustainable intensification for super efficiency. But what we really need to support all this is a food policy. We don't have one. If we're really going to take advantage of this food industry, which is the country's largest manufacturing industry, food production, if we're going to maximise the contribution of that industry, not only to social welfare here, but to gross domestic product and indeed to our trade balance, we really need a policy that gets behind the industry and the production of food. I don't think we have one, and I don't think one's on the horizon. Where's all the media focus these days? We've got a lot on vegetarianism, vegans, God help me, and yeah, right. I better shut up. And and of course, we talk a great deal about the impact of food consumption on the climate. What we hear very little about really is just where we are in terms of the contribution that science can make to rise into our challenges in the future. And we hear very little about the affordability of food. The assumption very often is, particularly from many of these groups, that we should be paying a lot more for our food. Really? It's all very well for, perhaps well-heeled middle-class people to say that, but what about the people who are unemployed, the people, single-parent families, the people on, zero-hour contracts, etc., the people who struggle to make ends meet? Their social welfare matters, and they are entitled to expect us to strive to produce affordable food. And I think it's all possible. We don't have to go down this road of saying we've got to raise the price of food. I insist it is perfectly possible for a modern, intensive food industry to rise to all these challenges. And moreover, if you're interested in people's health, etc., what's better than providing people with good quality, a wide choice, affordable food? That's more important to their health, and that's why most of us are much healthier than parents before us, and that's why we can devote less of our income to food, and in doing so, of course, we support many other industries. There's absolutely no conflict between a modern industrial food industry and the sort of objectives that people are concerned with. Now I want to draw your attention to a very important point. Certainly when it comes to middle classes, demand for food is changing. Of course, they are after what are called experience attributes. In other words, you know, when you eat your food or whatever, what you want is taste and you want value for money. And we all understand that. But increasingly, what is moving up the agenda is our credence attributes. What are they? You know, they're things like provenance, things like safety, animal welfare, sustainability, etc. These issues are now rising in importance for middle class people. I would say, you know, they are becoming key to competitiveness. And where are they delivered? These credence attributes are delivered at the farming stage in the food chain. So if you believe that in order to be competitive going forward, if you're going to satisfy the demands both here and abroad for you know, the food markets, then the argument for closer relationships, partnerships within the food chain starts to become overwhelming. And let me just... a bit of a busy slide, this, which I'll half apologise before I start. We have to focus on the final food product, and particularly if we're going to take advantage of those 2 billion middle-class potential customers in other parts of the world, okay? And here's my simple representation of a supply chain. Upstream suppliers would be your farmers, then you've got your food processors, and then your food services, exporters, retailers down the bottom. What do I mean by this word interdependence? In any transaction, there are two elements. There's a competitive element and there is an interdependent element, okay? And for many transactions, it's just a competitive element that matters to people, just trying to get the best price or whatever. But can you imagine Airbus and Rolls-Royce deciding in carrying out a transaction that for them it's just the price that matters? Of course it isn't. The interdependent element becomes critically important in that sort of relationship because they know their engines and their planes have to work together and the two are utterly dependent on each other. I would say we're in the same position when it comes to food and when it comes to the credence attributes I've spoken about. So what we've got to do is step up this interdependent thing, and we do that by bringing closer relationships within the supply chain. If we achieve that, of course, for farmers, they get, reduced risk. They've got to know who they're selling to. They get to know their customer better. Therefore, they can dedicate what they're doing to their particular buyer's needs. And remember, his credence attributes becoming more important, etc. And just go a few years ahead, when, technology will allow us to make far more adjustments to all manner of aspects of food production. These things will become much more important. They learn together, and very importantly, as you get closer together, you can dedicate or align your investment. What happens at the processor stage? They get less waste, they get improved logistics, they get the opportunities to innovate together with farmers, and of course to differentiate their products. At the end of the chain, of course, we're going to get greater transparency, which is what we want. Affordable prices, because there's a lot of efficiency in here. We're going to get better alignment to people's demands, superior quality, and of course, above all, you're going to get distinctive products based on these credence attributes. Who does this? Who demonstrates the success of this? The Dutch. A country of 16 million people, it's the world's second largest exporter of food. This is what they do. And they do other things as well, but they are light years ahead of us in terms of this interdependence and working closely together. I'll call it, vertical partnerships. And I really believe that this is We've talked about this for a long time, but we really haven't achieved very much. We need to move towards vertical partnerships. And you hear a lot of talk these days about, well, of course, farmers and processors, they do have to work more closely together, etc., etc. I insist, most of these arrangements are transactional. They are not partnerships in the sense that I mean. In other words, it may very well be that someone pays a slightly higher price in return for various the delivery of certain attributes, but it's not a partnership. If you have a partnership, the word means two people coming together. You need your partners to agree on their strategic outlook. They need to have the same sort of attitude, and of course they need to have matching capabilities. So it's not just a will-o'-the-wisp, I'll pay you a slightly higher price if you do X or Y or whatever. What you need is people coming together because they have the same objective in mind and they have the capabilities that can make it happen. If you have a partnership, you really need a collaborative architecture. You need an arrangement where you decide who's making the decisions or who makes what decisions. You need an arrangement whereby you know what you're measuring and what you're monitoring, and you need a structure which decides how the rewards are shared out. This is what you get in a real partnership. And the other thing you need in any partnership is goodwill trust. Not just the trust that if I order something from you, you will deliver it or whatever. Goodwill trust is like a good marriage. Both sides of the partnership are as concerned with the welfare of the other side as they are about their own welfare. They never think about trying to take advantage of the other. They work together for mutual benefit. This is what we learned from businesses in Japan, etc. And this is what the food industry is terribly bad at applying. I would go as far as to say there's less trust in the food train than in any other industrial sector. If I was talking to car manufacturers or people here, they just wouldn't understand what I'm talking about. They say, well, of course, this is what we have to do. We realise the success of our car depends on the, the effort and the alignment with the engine manufacturer or whatever it is. We need to get to the same position in the food industry. We have to recognise that as we want to increase competitiveness and as Credence attributes become more important, we really have to start to work much more closely together. We have to stop thinking we're so clever if we can drive a penny off this or a penny off that. We have to be looking to the medium or the longer term and saying, what is it we're trying to deliver? How can we best get there? And what do we each need to do to get there? That's the sort of mindset you need. And if we look to other industries, you'll find that, vertical partnerships are absolutely critical to bringing about more competitiveness because, you can improve your reputation, you tend to get more innovation, and you tend to reinforce the basis of your competitive advantage. So, let's turn our attention to sustainable intensification now. It's more than a credence good, really. You go back over the last 50 years or so, agriculture, the food industries, like any other industry. Productivity has really come about or been enhanced by replacing labour with machinery. Well, sustainable intensification says we have to take the same sort of mindset and apply it to natural resource productivity. In other words, we've got to really strive to produce more, and we've got to produce a lot more, by using less land, less water, less energy, etc. And how are we going to do that? First of all, we have to make full use of the fruits of science and technology. Technological advance. We're all familiar with incremental improvements. They're going on all the time, but I'm really interested in drastic and disruptive innovation. And best example, of course, of drastic innovation in food was when they shortened wheat straw. By doing that, they allowed yields to get a lot higher. We brought about a green revolution, and we rendered uneconomic all previous forms of growing wheat. We're now with agrobiotechnology, we're now on the cusp of another drastic innovation, which is going to take over this industry. Disruptive innovation, I think of that a bit more artificial intelligence, you know. At the moment, very few people use robotic milkers. 25 years' time, will anyone milk a cow except those individuals who seem to get pleasure from it? Most professionals will not be doing any such thing. Now, how do these technological advances, where the channels they come down through? One comes down through biotechnology, you know, improving the through genetics, improving the health and nutrition of animals and plants, etc. And the other goes down through what's known as precision farming, or digital farming, some people call it, which is essentially a fusion of engineering and information technology. In both these cases, we are just at the start of, we're on the cusp of a revolution. We are with these two areas where we were with computers at the start of the 1980s. I don't suppose many of you are old enough to remember the first word processors that came into offices in those early 80s. And what was the reaction of people? Oh, you go blind there looking at that computer screen, or your arm will fall off or whatever. No one, I don't care what anyone says today, no one saw the internet coming. No one saw the dramatic change that would have on our way of life. Well, food and farming is in the same position with these. You give us 20 or 30 years and it'll be unrecognisable. I would go as far as to say, you know, everything from taste to the way you milk cows, everything is going to change in the next 30 years or so. But to really take advantage of these changes, what we need is technical efficiency. You need the people at the farm level to be applying these advances. And what does that mean? You need the decision makers. You need their education, their experience, and their attitude. You need them to be able to apply the skill set that is going to be necessary in the future. And of course, that includes the ability to work vertically up and down the chain, and of course horizontally with other farmers. But I insist, if we want to have a food industry that is capable of feeding people at reasonable prices, if we want a food industry that's going to make its way in the world and become a successful exporting industry, if we want a food industry that's going to really be something that leads Britain in terms of the future, it is only by adopting these sort of sustainable techniques. Any other way, a lot of people talk, when you hear them talking about opportunities in agriculture, they're not talking about farming at all, really. Well, they are, but they're talking about getting higher prices and taking a step back to the 50s or something, you know, when there is this crazy idea that somehow or other the 1950s were a great time. They're abject poverty for most farmers, you know. The farming industry, food industry is far better off today, and if it wants a bright future, it needs to adopt the sort of things I've just spoken about here. What we don't talk about very much are people. And yet key to all of this are the people, skills. First of all, in order to take advantage of these opportunities I've spoken about, what we're going to see is a continuing increase in the scale of farming. Perhaps not so much with agri-biotechnology, but certainly when it comes to precision technology, investment is expensive. And if you're a larger scale business, you not only have access to the funds for investment, you also have a larger output over which to spread the costs. So, holdings are going to continue to get larger, and this calls for greater management skills, and the more so as the businesses are going to become more sophisticated, and of course they're going to have to manage across their boundaries. They're going to have to deal more closely with customers and complementers. Digital technology is with us. I've already implied it's going to change the way we work. Artificial intelligence is going to replace a lot of unskilled or low-skilled labour. And of course, we're going to use this data to monitor everything. So the skill set for farmers going ahead is going to be the ability to analyse very large amounts of data in real time and act upon it. You go forward 20 or 30 years, the typical farmer look like a city trading office at the moment. Someone will sit in front of a bank of computers, a load of information will be coming from drones, all sorts of sensors on animals or in fields, etc. And various other sources, and they will have to make decisions very quickly in order to maximise their advantage. It's a completely different skill set, and it's more in keeping with a high-tech sector than where we currently are. Next thing, very difficult to do. We need to develop this network mindset, okay? If you run your own business, you can just tell people what to do, and if you're lucky, they'll do it. But when you're managing across businesses, dealing with different people, you need, a very different skill set. Emotional intelligence is what people talk about here, the ability to listen, the ability to emphasise, the ability to just work across boundaries. And I see nothing in government policy really on this. We hear about apprenticeships, but that doesn't cut it at all. It doesn't get anywhere near what we really need here. What we need is a great big effort to help farming, build these sort of skills that will encourage cooperation, the IT skills and the people skills that are vital to success. So, where does it bring us to? The trouble with all this Brexit stuff is it's a terrible distraction. It's taken our eye off the ball. What we should be asking ourselves is, why is it in this country here, our rate of productivity growth is very poor compared, I'm talking about agriculture now, not just the country as a whole. Why is our rate of productivity growth so low down? 21 out of 28 when we were a member of Europe. It's not very good. Why is it that when it comes to exporting food, we are not in the top league in Europe, After the Dutch, it's the Germans, and then it's the French, etc. We're way down the list. We should be asking ourselves, why is it we haven't risen to these challenges and opportunities? Instead, we've wasted our time talking about something which has got nothing to do with this or our problems. I believe that collaborative partnerships are decisive, not only because the world is becoming more complex, not only because you work together to put these new technologies in place, but above all, I believe that in farming, collaborative partnerships are decisive because Credence attributes are becoming important, and that really calls for people recognising up and down the chain that they really have to work much more closely with their farming sector if they are really going to capture all the advantages that are inherent in it. And finally, a little plead from the heart here. And it's very unfashionable, to talk about an industrial food policy. Somehow or other we mustn't talk about the word industrial when it comes to food and farming. I put it to you, when you go to buy a new car and you go on the forecourt and the salesman approaches you, do you say to him, look, I don't want a car that's been produced by a modern industrial technique, give me one that's been bashed around with hammers or something? Yeah, you laugh. And yet we take that sort of mindset when it comes to food. There's nothing, we've allowed people to imply that industrial intensive food production is bad. Nothing of the sort. Industrial intensive food production has delivered the benefits that we all enjoy today. And we shouldn't allow people to go around implying that somehow or other these are the source of our problems. They are the source of great social benefit to us, and they are the source of future prosperity for the industry. What I believe is that unless the food industry sort of wakes up and recognises that it has to start arguing for this policy, they're going to give it away. We're going to see agriculture become more of a land management policy, more focused on conservation, etc. And we are going to import more food into this country. That's what you face at the moment. And if you open your eyes, you'll see that I'm right. Thank you very much.